Welcome to the deep dive. We're diving deep today, really deep, into the philosophy of Elisabeth, Princess Palatine of Bohemia.
A fascinating figure. And, we often hear her name in connection with Descartes.
Right. She's the one he dedicated his Principles of Philosophy to, right?
Yes, exactly. And his Passions of the Soul was written at her request. But for this deep dive, we're really shifting the focus.
Yeah, we want to understand her contributions as a philosopher in her own right.
Exactly. I think that's really crucial because, while her connection with Descartes is certainly historically important, we have so much to learn from her independent philosophical insights. And a lot of that comes through in her correspondence with Descartes.
Right, and it seems like they really covered so much ground in their letters.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they go from that mind-body problem, which we always love to grapple with,
Of course.
to causation and physics, the passions, ethics, even free will and political philosophy.
It's really impressive. It shows just how wide-ranging her intellectual curiosity was.
Yeah, and I think it's really important, too, to remember that Elisabeth wasn't just this abstract philosophical mind.
Right.
She was a princess living in exile in The Hague after her family lost the Bohemian throne.
Wow.
And her education, it was very thorough. She knew multiple languages, and she was deeply knowledgeable in logic, mathematics, philosophy, the sciences.
I mean, that's where she earned the nickname Le Grec, right?
Exactly. And later on, she became the abbess of Hereford. So not only did she manage this really diverse community, but she also provided refuge for marginalized religious groups.
And she was involved in some pretty serious political negotiations too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So all of these lived experiences definitely, shaped and informed her philosophical views.
Okay. Well, let's start unpacking some of this. Maybe we can begin with the mind-body problem, which, as you mentioned, is always a fun one. And this was really where Elisabeth really pressed Descartes, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, she initiated their philosophical exchange with this question that I think is just cuts to the core of Cartesian dualism. And what was the question exactly?
She basically asked, how can an immaterial mind, something that doesn't have any physical extension, how can it interact with and cause changes in a material body?
Yeah, that's a big one. It's
Right.
like asking, how can a thought, lift a table?
Exactly. And, she pointed out that at the time, the standard way of understanding causation was so closely tied to the idea of extension, like physical contact or the transmission of motion. So it makes you wonder, right?
It does.
I mean, how could this non-extended mind, something that Descartes was saying was purely thinking substance, actually do anything to a physical body?
It seems like she really hit a nerve there.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Elisabeth was so sharp. I mean, she identified this core tension, this potential contradiction within Descartes' whole framework. And I think it's important to note that she wasn't trying to say that mind-body interaction was impossible.
She was really challenging Descartes to explain the mechanism of this interaction, or maybe even reconsider the nature of the mind itself so that it would fit better with these mechanistic models of causation.
So she was essentially saying, hey, either tell me how this works or maybe rethink what the mind actually is.
Exactly.
So I'm dying to know, how did Descartes respond to this?
Well, this is where it gets interesting and maybe a little frustrating. His responses, well, they weren't completely satisfying. At one point, he even tried to use this analogy of heaviness.
Heaviness?
Yeah, the idea that heaviness causes a body to fall in the same way that the mind causes the body to act.
But wait, didn't Descartes himself critique these kinds of scholastic explanations, the kind that relied on heaviness and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. He was a major figure in moving away from that. And Elisabeth, she was quick to point this out. Oh, yeah. She argued that invoking heaviness as an explanation was just unintelligible. It didn't offer a mechanistic account of how things actually worked. And this was important because Elisabeth was really committed to this idea of efficient causation.
Right, that things are caused by direct physical interactions and the transfer of motion.
Exactly. And, she was really engaged with the emerging scientific worldview, which was all about finding the physical laws and causes behind things.
So she wasn't going to be satisfied with some vague, non-mechanistic explanation.
Exactly.
Okay, so she pushes back on this heaviness thing, then what?
Well, she goes even further. She suggests that maybe the way our bodies affect our thoughts, like how animal spirits or vapors can influence our emotions.
Yeah.
Well, she suggests that this might actually point to the mind having a material nature.
So not this completely separate immaterial thing.
Right, because if our thinking can be directly impacted by our physical state,
Yeah.
then maybe the mind isn't completely distinct from the body.
It's a really fascinating point. It challenges this whole idea of the mind being totally independent from the physical world.
Yeah, and it gets to the heart of what substance dualism really means.
So she's really pushing Descartes to reconsider some of his most fundamental ideas.
Absolutely. And then she brings up this other point that I think is super interesting. She talks about the autonomy of thought.
Like our ability to choose what we think about.
Exactly. She acknowledged that we have this capacity, but she questioned whether it's truly independent of the physical body.
Right. I mean, we all know how our physical state can affect our focus, our mood, our ability to think clearly.
Exactly. So she was basically saying that even though we have this feeling of control over our thoughts, it's not like our minds are operating in some completely separate realm, unaffected by what's happening in our bodies.
Right, right. And then there's that really fascinating observation she makes about her nature as female and how it might be influencing her ability to reason.
Yeah, this is a really intriguing moment in their correspondence. And it's kind of ahead of its time in a way.
How so?
Well, she's bringing her own embodied experience as a woman into this philosophical discussion. She's suggesting that maybe her nature as female is a bodily condition that could be impacting her rational capacities.
Yeah.
It's like she's opening the door to consider how social and biological factors might play a role in philosophical inquiry.
Wow. So how did Descartes take that?
Well, unfortunately, he kind of dismissed it.
Really?
Yeah, he said that, of course, a certain level of health is needed for clear thinking, but he didn't really engage with the idea that her specifically female embodiment might be a relevant factor.
Oh, that's too bad. It would have been interesting to hear more of his thoughts on that.
Yeah, definitely. But I think it's important to highlight what Elisabeth was doing there. She was pushing the boundaries of what was considered relevant in philosophical discussions.
Okay, so we've talked quite a bit about the mind-body problem, but as we mentioned earlier, Elisabeth was interested in so much more than just metaphysics.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Her engagement with mathematics and natural philosophy is just as fascinating. It shows that she was deeply interested in the emerging scientific ideas of her time.
And she was pretty good at math, too, right?
Oh, yeah. Really talented.
Yeah.
Like, Descartes himself challenged her with this really tough geometry problem.
What kind of problems?
It's called Apollonius's problem. Basically, you have to find a circle that's tangent to three other circles. It can get really complex.
I'm sure.
Yeah, and she solved it. And Descartes was super impressed with her solution. He even commented on how elegant and symmetrical it was.
So this wasn't just her messing around with some equations. She was engaging with some pretty high-level mathematics.
Absolutely. And we also know that she probably learned a lot of this from Johann Stampion, who was a well-known mathematician at the time.
So she was really plugged into this intellectual community.
Oh, yeah, totally. Like, she was involved in the hiring of Franz von Schuten at Leiden. He was a key figure in the development of Cartesian mathematics. And John Pell, another big name in math, actually asked for her help with understanding Descartes' geometry.
Wow. So she wasn't just learning from these guys, she was helping them out, too.
Exactly. She was a respected figure in her own right.
And then, of course, there's that famous dedication of the principles of philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty huge public acknowledgement of her intellectual capabilities.
It is. But it's also interesting that she didn't just accept the dedication passively.
Right. She really dug into the book and offered some pretty insightful criticisms of Descartes' explanations of things like magnetic attraction and the heaviness of Mercury.
So even with someone she clearly respected, she wasn't afraid to disagree.
Not at all. She was committed to thinking for herself.
And she wasn't just interested in critiquing others' ideas, right?
No, definitely not. I mean, she was really interested in finding efficient causal explanations for all sorts of natural phenomena.
Like what?
Well, for example, she was critical of Kenelm Digby's interpretations of natural events.
Okay.
She requested works by other natural philosophers, like Hoagland and Regis.
I see.
And there's evidence that she even tried to promote Cartesian physics in Germany. And it wasn't just physics. She was interested in the mechanistic explanations for diseases and their cures.
So she was really thinking about how these new scientific ideas could be applied to understanding the world around her.
Exactly. And her interest in natural philosophy didn't stop there. After Descartes' death, there's evidence she was involved in discussions about astronomy, particularly the debates about Jupiter's moons and efforts to map the moon with these, increasingly powerful telescopes.
Wow. So her mind was always working, always exploring.
Absolutely.
Okay, so now I'm curious about another area of their correspondence. Their discussions on passions and moral philosophy. This is where Descartes tries to help Elisabeth with what he thinks is her sadness stemming from the English Civil War.
Yeah, that's right. And they start by talking about Seneca and Stoicism, but then they move on to Descartes' own ideas about virtue.
And how did Elisabeth react to his views on virtue?
Well, she had some pretty significant objections.
Really? Like what?
Well, Descartes defined virtue as this, like, firm resolution to do what one judges to be best. But Elisabeth, she argued that good intentions alone aren't enough.
Right. I mean, we can all have good intentions, but things don't always work out the way we planned.
Exactly. And she was worried that Descartes' definition made virtue seem immune to, well, to luck, to all the unpredictable things that can happen in the world.
Okay, yeah, I see her point.
And she even extended this idea to our capacity for judgment. Like, she was saying that even our ability to make the best judgment can be influenced by circumstances outside of our control.
So even our reasoning isn't immune to chance.
Right. And, this is a pretty Aristotelian point of view, that virtue isn't just about having the right intention. It's also about developing practical wisdom and making choices that lead to good outcomes. And Elisabeth brought in a Stoic perspective, too.
Oh, how so?
Well, she argued that even if we act with good intentions, we can still feel regret if things go wrong.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. Even if we do what we think is right, we can still feel bad if it leads to unintended consequences.
Right, and for Elisabeth, this meant that virtue didn't necessarily guarantee happiness.
So doing the right thing doesn't always make us happy.
Exactly. And she even said that we would need infinite science to achieve true contentment.
Infinite science.
Yeah, like a perfect and complete understanding of all the possible consequences of our actions. And this idea actually echoes the Stoic belief that inner peace is intertwined with our external circumstances.
Okay, so for Elisabeth, it wasn't enough to simply have the right intentions. We also need some degree of good fortune and a clear understanding of the consequences of our actions to truly be happy.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary of her view.
Okay. And within this whole discussion of human action and motivation, Elisabeth asks Descartes to define the passions.
Yes. And this is what leads him to write The Passions of the Soul.
Right.
It was her question that prompted that whole treatise.
So she really influenced his thinking in some pretty significant ways.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's interesting to consider why she was so interested in understanding the passions.
Why was that?
Well, she was worried about how our personal biases, our temperament, our habits, our self-interest, all of that could distort our judgment.
So how can we know what's truly good or right if our judgment is clouded by all of these things?
Exactly. And this led her to think about how we might objectively measure or assess value. Some scholars even suggest that she might have been leaning towards a Hobbesian or contractarian view.
Meaning what?
Well, the idea that good might emerge from this process of balancing competing self-interests within a society.
Okay, interesting. So how did Descartes respond to these ethical concerns?
Well, he tried to offer some grounding by appealing to, metaphysical truths.
Like what?
Like the existence of God, the nature of the mind, the order of the universe. He thought that these fundamental truths could provide a framework for ethical decision-making.
Okay, I see.
But Elisabeth wasn't fully convinced. She pointed out that these metaphysical ideas, while interesting, didn't really offer much practical guidance for everyday ethical dilemmas.
Yeah, it's one thing to contemplate the nature of the universe, but it's another thing to figure out how to act when faced with a difficult choice in real life.
Exactly. And Elisabeth was always grounded in the concrete realities of human experience.
Right. So now I want to talk about their discussions on political philosophy. This is something that seems particularly relevant to Elisabeth's own life.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, as an exiled princess, she had a vested interest in questions of governance.
Right. And it seems like she was especially interested in understanding how people make decisions when they don't have all the information.
Yeah, and this makes perfect sense given her family's situation and her hope for their eventual restoration.
And in one of her letters, she specifically asked Descartes for his maxims on civil life.
Yes, and she also wanted to know his thoughts on Machiavelli's The Prince, which is obviously a very influential and somewhat controversial book about politics.
Right, right. And I think Descartes was hesitant to give her specific maxims.
Yeah, he kind of demurred on that.
Mm-hmm.
But he did offer his thoughts on Machiavelli. And Elisabeth, she responded with her own really insightful interpretation of Machiavelli's work.
Oh, what does she say?
Well, she acknowledged the value of Machiavelli's focus on achieving political stability, especially for, new states or during periods of upheaval.
Right.
But she thought his analysis was less helpful when it came to actually governing a stable state.
So she saw the limitations of Machiavelli's approach.
Yeah, and I think this speaks to her deeper concern with the ongoing challenges of just and effective governance, not just with seizing power or maintaining order.
It sounds like she was really searching for a practical philosophy of governance that could deal with the complexities of human nature and the inevitable conflicts that arise in any society.
Yeah, absolutely. And some scholars suggest that she was looking for a more pragmatic approach, something that could effectively resolve conflicts and ensure the well-being of the community.
And this might have been influenced by her own experiences, navigating the world of politics in exile.
Oh, for sure. And it's interesting to contrast her perspective with Descartes. He tended to rely on a kind of divinely guaranteed order.
Right.
But Elisabeth, she seemed to favor a more realistic and operational approach to dealing with the messiness of political life.
And then there's that later letter where she talks about the potential conflict between governing and philosophizing.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating observation.
What did she say exactly?
Well, she basically said that rulers don't have the same luxury as philosophers. Well, philosophers can dedicate themselves to thinking and reasoning. They can take their time. But rulers are constantly bombarded with urgent demands. They have to make quick decisions. They have to deal with, all the passions swirling around in their courts.
So she's saying that the nature of their roles shapes their thinking in different ways.
Exactly.
And it makes me think about her time as Abbess of Hereford. She was not only a spiritual leader, but also responsible for managing this whole community, navigating internal conflicts, and even engaging in political negotiations.
Yeah, and I think it's very likely that her philosophical reflections on governance informed her approach to leadership.
So as we wrap up, I think it's really clear that Elisabeth was far more than just a student of Descartes or a passive correspondent.
Oh, absolutely. Her philosophical contributions are undeniable.
She wasn't afraid to challenge him, to think for herself, and to develop her own unique perspectives.
And it's amazing to think that we get this window into her thinking primarily through her letters. It shows just how valuable philosophical correspondence can be, not just for understanding the big names, but for recognizing the contributions of those whose ideas might not have been, formally published.
Absolutely. And I think Elisabeth's work is especially relevant today.
In what way?
Well, she was really attuned to the limitations of abstract reason. She saw how easily our judgment can be influenced by factors outside of our control. And she was always focused on the practical implications of philosophical ideas, on how they could help us navigate the complexities of real life. I think those are lessons we can all learn from.
I agree. And it makes me wonder, how might her insights help us deal with the challenges we face today, in our own decision-making and in the way we govern our societies?
Yeah, it's a question worth pondering.
And I really encourage everyone to delve deeper into her correspondence. There's so much to discover there.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.